All right. Now we're looking at British North America. And really, again, as a historian, we cannot understate the significance of 1588. Once the Spanish Armada is done and the Spanish have now began its relatively rapid decline, it allowed for a new group of Europeans to colonize North America. And the first one we're going to look at is British North America. British North America in 1607, the Virginia Company of London established the first colony, Jamestown. We live in Virginia. You should know that like the back of your hand. If not, make sure you put that in your head. But in 1607, the first permanent colony created by a joint stock company. And again, it's so important that you understand these are joint stock companies. This is not the British military, just like in India. It is a joint stock company coming over to North America for profit. By 1630, Massachusetts Bay Colony has a company has really formed another colony. So now we have colonies here and up here, and we begin to see the framework, the skeleton, if you will, of the colonies. By 1670, the British claimed the Hudson Bay, very important. And I think as I'm drawing this map, you can see a problem developing. But I do want to point out something called the enclosure movement. So bear with me here for a second, okay? The enclosure movement, there's two of them that happen. We're talking about the first one. This is the Elizabethan one. So during Elizabeth's reign, we know that Philip II screwed up the economy in Spain. Do you remember that? Spain taxed their wool exports, causing the English to begin to raise their own sheep for their, well, what does it take? More people to manage sheep or grow crops? Please, if you said grocery, bless your heart, it is grow crops. Crops are so much more labor intensive. You literally need like one person for a flock of sheep. So all of a sudden, if you're a English noble and you're beginning to shift away and you're like, wait a minute, I can make lots of money off of the sheep industry. Which one are you going to do? Do you want a lot of people in which you have to manage crops, or do you want a handful of people to manage the sheep that's much more profitable? Of course. So what happened is the British nobles began to enclose their lands or build fences to raise a sheep. They only need a handful of peasants to help that. So guess what happened to the rest of the peasants? They were forced into the urban areas. This is called urbanization. So the enclosure movement begins to see England go from a estate system rural society into a more modern version of an urban society where large amounts of peasants are going to be forced into the urban areas. The problem is there are no jobs in the city. So now you're going to see during the Elizabethan time period, you're going to see an uptick in urban poverty, urban crime, really disease, disgust. These are not the cities that you and I recognize at all. These are medieval villages now becoming overpopulated. Well, in the 17th century, what's going to happen is, if you remember, those guys, those peasants who can no longer afford to live in England, they become what we call that's not right, indentured servants. And if you forgot what an indentured servant was, an indentured servant was somebody who said, "Hey, if you get me to the new world, I will give you 7 years of labor." So it looks a little like slavery, but in return, the indentured servant is going to come to America, do farming, learn a skill, and then within 7 years, he's going to be able to become his own person, which is a really important element. And then they become colonists. So the indentured servants become the and now all of a sudden, we're going to have a significant amount of white people moving into this area to populate this as indentured servants. Very significant. They were escaping the poverty, escaping the hopelessness caused by the enclosure movement. And now there's a significant white English population developing what we call the 13 colonies. By 1750, the colonies were called overpopulated, with a population of 1.5 million. You and I might say that's not overpopulated at all, but during this time period, 1.5 million people in this area was heavily challenged its infrastructure. And we'll talk more about the significance of that later. So with that said, we now have identified British. The British is going to be here and here. Now we're going to develop French North America. Early in the 1530s, Jacques Cartier claimed the St. Lawrence River. He claimed the St. Lawrence River. He was trying to find a northwest passage, which was supposed to be a quicker route to Asia, but instead he discovered the St. Lawrence River. St. Lawrence River is going to be the backbone structure of the French Empire in North America. Samuel de Champlain in 1608 established Quebec. And now, all of a sudden, by 1608, we now have a French colony that is going to oversee what we call French Canada along the St. Lawrence River. Down the road, and a little bit later, Robert La Salle is going to claim the Mississippi River Valley for France. So now all of a sudden we're beginning to see that really there's a vast amount. Look at New France. And New France has divided whose empire? The British Empire. We already know the British Empire this side is overpopulated. They're trying to move westward. Do you think the French are going to be excited about that? Of course not. This really created the setting of this Anglo-French rivalry we're about to talk about. But I think as a historian, we need to pause here. We need to talk a little bit about the estate system. What had happened to the estate system in England? I hope you remember, because of the enclosure system, the enclosure movement, the estate system began to weaken. The nobles were no longer dominating the people. People were moving to the urban areas, but without any jobs, you had a migration into the 13 colonies. Well, in France, they're going to maintain the estate system. The estate system became a chief part of the French culture. So what gives the nobility power? Dominance of the peasants. So are they going to have an enclosure movement? Of course not. Their power derives about the amount of peasants and land they own. Because the estate system, France resisted urbanization. And without a white population moving into the urban areas, France does not become, quote unquote, overpopulated because they are equally distributed throughout France. So therefore, there's no stress. And without that, what can you say about the population of New France? There's not a lot of white people that are going to come here. There's going to be a handful of traders, fur traders. There will be some farmers who might come this way. But the French North America will have such a small, minute French population. They're going to be dependent on their relationship with the Native Americans, where the 13 colonies are very different. And that's going to lead us right to the Anglo-French rivalry. I'm going to pause here.